Good morning and welcome to Edelman Editions. We're in the Edelman offices in Westminster in central London, just a few hundred yards away from the Houses of Parliament, where yesterday George Osborne presented his third budget, the third budget in the coalition since May 2010. I'm delighted to say that to discuss the UK budget and other more global matters, we're joined this morning by Jim O'Neill, Chairman of Goldman Sachs Asset Management, passionate Manchester United fan, the man who gave us the bricks, we can talk about that a bit in a moment, and author of The Growth Map, a new book about growth and where it's going to come from. So we've got a lot to talk about this morning, Jim. But I don't know how many UK budgets you've had to sit through over the years. Perhaps it'd be polite not to say. But what did you make of yesterday's performance?
Well, to be quite honest, I didn't really pay a huge amount of attention to it because, of course, under this coalition, it sort of predates them a little bit. The whole importance of the budget is not quite what it once was because of the November spending statement. And then in addition, there have been so much leaked in the past week, including the day before, almost specifically what came out. So I was pretty preoccupied doing other things. But, I looked at it afterwards. As it turns out, it was exactly as leaked. It was more interesting probably for the politics than the economics. They didn't even change the forecast of the economy much, or the state of the government's finances, not just for this year and the years ahead. So, in that sense, it was remarkably dull.
They've set out their stall 2 years ago on the fiscal retrenchment. I mean, the deadline has rolled over a bit beyond the lifetime of this first Parliament, but they haven't changed that at all, and that's the message they've sent.
Yeah, I mean, what more seriously, what I would say at the margin is, of the three that he's done, we're coming out of this one where this feeling of, we're going to tighten everything, it's going to be tough forever. There's a slightly different mood around, I think, and they certainly haven't had to revise the forecast down about the economy, actually revise them up slightly. The finances look a little bit better, and so I think there is a mood which I'm surprised they didn't encourage it a bit further, that what we've done is now proving fruitful, and we're through the worst of it. Maybe because of some of the shocks that have been going on elsewhere in the world, they're reluctant to go that far. But I think the underlying picture is a bit better than they might have hoped for a few months ago, to be honest. So I see it as a possible turning point for the stance they've had to take. But I was in the camp that thought initially they were being tougher than they should have been. But given where we've got to, they've managed to get through it without it being an absolute disaster, and hopefully that's, we've reached some kind of turning point in terms of the stance of fiscal policy at least.
That's very interesting, because at the time of the election and that 5 days in May when the coalition was formed, there was some quite excited talk about, if a government isn't formed now, we're going to be in the same position as Greece, that this deficit is so scary that markets are going to react very badly. Did you feel some of that talk was a bit overdone?
I think that's what actually drove them to the degree of restrictive fiscal policy that they adopted, because, and it's often forgotten by people, that the weekend it was formed was one of the worst days in the early part of the Greek crisis. So they would have been being advised by senior civil servants that whatever you're going to do, you've got to get together and do something. And I think probably George Osborne, particularly, being quite an astute political tea leaf reader, kind of managed to bring that into some of his philosophical thinking as well, and it sort of dominated his role in it all. And in some ways it's been quite clever, albeit I think quite risky. From a pure economics perspective, I do not think they needed to have been quite as tough as they were, and there is some evidence that has harmed the economy more than should have been the case.
Interesting, because growth is what you're about, and growth and Goldman's been pushing quite a positive message about growth. That's what we really want, and there wasn't a lot of talk about that yesterday, about jobs and...
Well, because the evidence, of course, has been so disappointing. There was optimism expressed about the forecast going from 0.7 to 0.8 for this year, but in a world where China's growing, people are disappointed about China growing at only 8% or something. I mean, 0.8? It's not much, is it? But you lead me into a broader point here that I often reflect back on and talk to leading policy figures in the UK about. There is often a mood here amongst the elites that the whole world is dealing with this post-08 crisis still in the way that we seem to be doing, persistently. But it's not true. Much of the rest of the world, including parts of Europe, not many parts of Europe, but Germany, doing just fine. And yet, here there's this mood that the glory days will never come back. We're stuck with weak growth forever, etc., etc. And it's not the case for the rest of the world. That's for sure.
Well, there is this media punch-up, and as we've seen this morning in the British newspapers, much focus on so-called granny tax and allowance being frozen, and the punch-up over the top rate of tax. But as you say, actually, in the scheme of things, relatively minor adjustments in a big fiscal program.
Yeah, there are times, as you know, I travel around the world a lot, and there are sometimes I come back to the UK and I look at the media and I think people have completely taken leave of the senses, because the kind of hype and excitement that gets people so wound up on a regular basis here, including what you've just said, it's sort of like, all right, guys, in a big scheme of things, does any of this really matter? And of course, given where I come from, the whole thing about finance and people trying to have a bash at finance still, nearly 4 years on from the crisis, it's kind of look forward, stop being so reflective about why we had this crisis. Lots of people played a guilty role in it, government policymakers and the central bank as well.
And
but,
media.
move forward. The rest of the world isn't going to sit around waiting for us to stop feeling sorry for ourselves about what's happened.
So say a little more about how the UK economy actually, far from us being on our own, on a little island, is actually connected into a European and a global economy.
This is more than a little relevant. The UK doesn't live in an isolated box. The UK is part of the same world as everybody else, and ultimately we should be doing better because of what's going on in other large parts of the world. I touched on Germany earlier. Last month, Germany had its lowest unemployment for 20 years. And yet, again, if you just read the media here in the UK about Europe, you would think the whole of Europe was in the worst depression it's ever had.
Yes.
And Germany is 1/3 of the euro area, and it's not affecting them, so why should it affect us so much? And so that gets completely blown out of proportion as well. There's this assumption here that the euro crisis is so bad, it's devastating everywhere around the world, but it's not even causing any trouble in Germany, which is the biggest country in Europe. And that's because, and this is I deliberately say all of this, because that's a big lesson for the UK to think about. Germany is doing well because it exports so much to the BRIC countries. At the end of last year, German exports to all the 4 BRIC countries collectively are now bigger than German exports to France. And particularly growing very strongly to China. It's quite possible within another 12 months that Germany may be exporting more to China alone than it's doing to France. Here in the UK, we still export as much to Ireland as we do to the 4 BRICS together. So it's quite a difference.
What's going wrong? Because clearly in India, for example, we should have affinities, language ties, cultural ties, tradition. That should be a rich opportunity. To mention just one of the countries.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is our great hope for the rest of this decade, actually. But it doesn't feel it at the moment because there is no huge evidence of it. But the speed at which these countries are becoming more important, that follows straight on from India. Boston Consulting Group came out with a very BRIC-like report 2 weeks ago in which they estimate the value of consumption in India will go from just under $1 trillion today to 3.6 trillion by the end of this decade, so an increase of 2.6 in 10 years. And they're going to be wanting a lot of stuff. And as you say, given our history and the fact that 200 million Indian people work in the English language, that should be a huge opportunity for us. The Chinese consumer will probably grow at double that rate. And by the end of this decade, the value of consumption in the BRIC countries is going to be bigger than the US. And I often say to policymakers here, given the language, the time zone, and the fact that the world connects so much through this kind of media and many others, it should be fantastic for the UK, particularly London. And I suspect as we creep through the decade, there are going to be more and more signs of that coming through. But I think it requires a bit more focus from policymakers to try and think more outwardly to many of these countries, including in terms of philosophy. Give you a sort of slightly odd example in that regard. I often get wonderful wisdom, usually via email, from people about how I should drop the R in BRIC because people don't like Russia. They don't, this horrible, nasty Putin. But it might be a country that doesn't run itself the way that we would like, but it's a rapidly rising country. The figures that I play around with, Russia will probably contribute as much to the world as the whole of the euro area put together this decade. And I don't get told by many German people that I should drop the R in BRIC, and that's because Germany is already exporting a lot of stuff to them. But we're not going to get very far with Russia if we take a basic stance. We don't like you because you don't behave like we would.
So the businesses that you see trading effectively in BRIC countries and the countries that are orientated successfully towards the BRIC countries, what is it that they're getting right that perhaps some of us in Britain could learn to do a bit better?
I mean, I think Germany is particularly unique because it has, of course, a rich post-war history of being a really good exporter. But they concentrate, whether it be large or small firms, on precision and quality and timeliness with so many of their products. And another sense in that regard, that they actually still do it with things that many other people and countries would believe it's really hard for an advanced country to provide. So, for example, they export a huge amount of cars from Germany. In fact, one of the odd things about China is that the value attached to a German brand car is so high that these days many Chinese consumers would rather buy a 5 Series BMW, that same model that is made in Germany as opposed to one that's being made in China. And it's a huge. It's not an easy thing to replicate for other countries or companies very quickly. But somehow we've got to build that kind of depth of quality. As time passes, shifting it to a slightly more optimistic tack, and I do suspect part of it has been fortune for Germany at this stage of the BRIC cycle, particularly with the big infrastructure build that's been going on in China and India. And as those countries and their consumers get wealthier, they're probably going to want to buy a different type of thing from the rest of the world. And so services, financial services, legal services, particularly as they try to develop a better system of doing business, that might start to bring the benefits more naturally to the likes of the UK, and particularly things that originate out of London. So I think this is going to be a big thing for the UK.
So there are opportunities. We need a global outlook. We need to forget about some of the pantomime up the road in Westminster and concentrate on quality and partnerships. I mean, BRIC countries are open for partnerships. They're pretty robust business partners. The Brazilians are formidable.
Think outward. Another thing, education. I mean, all these people want to speak in English. One of the most stunning things that influenced my mind, and one of my many trips to China, I think this was in 2009, my wife was with me. We happened to be taking a couple of days' holiday and was cycling through a very small village, and we came across this wall. It had this big billboard on it, and it was quite astonishing. Even as I said, and it said, "Success in English equals success in life." Middle of nowhere. And we'd been advised by people I knew that we shouldn't travel around without a guide because we'd really struggle. But everywhere we went, people were trying to speak to us in English. And so I say to some people here, instead of trying to put restrictions on immigration, why not actually think about opening branches of our best universities all over China, India and Russia, for example, and deep links through education, which, amongst other things, could influence their cultures over the long term, but it certainly is something that these people all want. And Germans can't do that. They can't provide an English-speaking education. At least I hope not.
Well, this is fascinating. We didn't hear a lot about this yesterday, unfortunately. We didn't hear a lot about growth and jobs. But this morning you're telling us that there's quite an encouraging growing world out there that wants to do business with us.
I'll put it in the context of, and I think part of it is a generational thing. There are so many people that have grown up in my generation or our generation or are older, just don't really understand how the world's changing. I'm very fond of saying in the context of the European crisis that China creates the equivalent of another Greek economy every 11 and a half weeks. And in fact, I sent a note to some of the Chancellor's advisors that I know well that yesterday, by coincidence, Budget Day was the 11 and a half week day of 2012. So yesterday, China had created, since the start of the year, the equivalent of another Greece. And so, you know, why are people so focused on something like Greece? I mean, you know, it's an interesting place and nice place for a holiday, but it's not what makes the world economy go round.
It's not where the numbers are.
No.
Well, Jim, thanks very much for sharing some of your insights and experiences this morning. It's very, very encouraging stuff, and been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, and thanks for watching.